ค่ะสวัสดีนะคะสวัสดีทุกท่านนะคะกับสวัสดีท่านอาจารย์ฉันทนานะคะแล้วก็สปีกเกอร์ทุกท่านนะคะรวมถึงผู้ฟังที่ฟังผ่านทาง Facebook Live ของสถาบันวิจัยสังคมด้วยค่ะสำหรับวันนี้นะคะเป็นครั้งที่3ค่ะในซีรีส์งานสัมมนาวิชาการออนไลน์นะคะของสถาบันวิจัยสังคมจุฬาลงกรณ์มหาวิทยาลัยค่ะในวันนี้นะคะที่เราจะมาพูดกันเราจะพูดถึงสังคมหลังโควิด -19 ผลกระทบและการฟื้นฟูอย่างยั่งยืนนะคะในวันนี้ค่ะจะเป็นการนำเสนอนะคะในรูปแบบภาษาอังกฤษทั้งหมดนะคะจากมุมมองหลายๆมุมมองในเชิงนโยบายหรือว่าเชิงแมคโครนะคะจากหลากหลายนานาชาติเลยนะคะโอเคค่ะ Good afternoon honorable discussion distinguished speaker and all participants on behalf of Social Research Institute Chulalongkorn University I would like to extend my warm welcome to you all to the third in the series of Post-COVID-19 Society Forum. My name is Pichaya Sulaponchai as a moderator today. And today we will talk about what is the sustainable social recovery after COVID-19, learning from international experience. And today we have some questions that exploring national post-COVID recovery plans and policy, sustainable or same. Before we start the presentation, I would like to welcome Dr. Surangrat Jamniangpon, Deputy Director of Social Research Institute, Chulalongkorn University, for introduction about COVID-19 Society Forum. Please.
Good afternoon, everyone. I would like to have an introduction about our online series about post-COVID-19 society. The Social Research Institute, we have 5 panels for in the series. We start from the special lecture from Professor Chaiwastha Anand about future and transformative leader in post-COVID society. In the 3rd of September. And last week, we have a panel about the social impact for the vulnerable group, for informal worker, elderly, farmer, and food worker. That based on our research program. And now this is the 3rd panel that we talk about the lesson learned from international experience. And tomorrow we will have another panel about the implication of the post-COVID-19 to the future. And the last panel will be in 24th of September. That's about the feedback to the Thai government measure about the COVID recovery. So today we really welcome about your participation from Philippines, from Indonesia, and our friend from SCI. So I hope to see the international lens about the COVID outside of Thailand. Thank you.
Thank you. Let's start. May I introduce of the four presenter. Today we have 4 presentations. The first one from Dr. Pornpos Sidan. He is from Social Research Institute, Chulalongkorn University. He will talk about policy and measure to reduce economic and social impact. The second one from Dr. Warden Bello from Focus on the Global South. He will talk about crisis or opportunity from COVID-19. And the I'm so sorry. Dr. Walden will be the third one. But for the second one is Dr. Leonie Pearson. She will talk about SDG and the COVID-19. And the fourth one, Professor Dr. Paulus Widutomo will talk about social resilience in the new normal era. And I would like to welcome our honorable discussion, Professor Dr. Chantana Banpasiri Chodwan Gao, Professor at the Asian Study Institute Chulalongkorn University for this series. Okay, each presentation will take around 15 minutes for the first round, and then Professor Dr. Chantana will give some feedback and lens from the international lens. Okay. I will introduce the first presentation about Dr. Pornpot Sidan. Today, he will talk about the study of policy and measure to reduce economic and social impacts in response to the COVID-19 crisis, preliminary finding from the 6 countries. Dr. Pornpot Sidan, he is the head of research unit of BCG toward sustainable development. He is an expert to applying systemic approach to develop social innovation. So, Dr. Pornpot, please start your presentation.
Good afternoon, everyone. Can I share the screen? Okay. Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Today, I would like to talk about in the research topic, the study of policies and measures to reduce economic and social impact in response to the COVID crisis, preliminary finding from 6 countries. In this talk, I would like to separate into 6 main sections, starting from introduction, research objectives, research methodologies, research sample, research finding, and finally conclusion and recommendation. Let's start in the first part, the introduction about the world economies. The COVID-19 pandemic has had some more negative impact on activity in the first half of 2020 than anticipated. Global growth is projected at minus 4.9% in 2020, 1.9% point below the April 2020 World Economic Outlook forecast. The adverse impact on low-income households is particularly acute, imperiling the significant progress made in reducing extreme poverty in the world since 1990. From this figure in the left-hand side, we can see that the global growth is projected at minus 1.9% in 2020, and the recovery is projected to be more gradual than previously forecast. In 2021, global growth is projected about 5.4%. As with the April 2020 WEO projection, there is a higher than usual degrees of uncertainty around this forecast. The baseline projection rests on key assumptions about the fallout from the pandemic in economies with declining infection rates. The slower recovery path in the updated forecast reflect persistent social distancing into the second half of 2020. Greater scaling from the larger than anticipated hit to activity during the lockdown in the first half and second quarter in 2020 and a hit to productivities surviving business, ramp up necessary workplace safety and hygiene practice. To contain the economic impact of the COVID-19 pandemic so far, countries have approved physical action amount to more than $8 trillion, $3.3 trillion for the spending for foregone revenues, $2.7 trillion in guarantees, and $1.8 trillion for public sector loan. In these figures, we can see that the global measurements allow the world to more than $8 trillion in fiscal support. It's not sufficient for this crisis. The global compensation sum of coronavirus now is over than $8 trillion. We can see that the inequality between the rich country and the poor country, including the rich and the poor, causes a severe wound to the world economies. Nonetheless, the IMF's analysis stated that what they're mostly concerned is the country in Africa and Latin America could not access the financial aid. Even just 2 or 3 billion US dollar, which the rich country use the financial canal to fight coronavirus, but in the poor country have only water gun instead of the bazooka, something like that. In this figure refer to the information of IMF reporting the access to the financial aid of 60 countries, which have been verified and presented by Bloomberg. Regarding the countries in the Asia Pacific, the figure looks better than Europe. China has executed the stimulation measure about 4,200,000 million, is about 3% of GDP. And the other countries are looking presently in Asia. For Thailand, S&P Global anticipates that the unemployment rate lower than 1%, which seems to be all right, due to the unemployment figure is the major economic driving. Japan seems to be underglass this debt due to the debt to GDP is high, over 200%, and the government injected but just more than 20% of GDP. Due to the COVID-19, it could be said that this is really different. The type of the crisis from the past. International Monetary Fund IMF estimate that the world economies in this year will contract 3%, the lowest in the second quarter and the worst since the Great Depression in 1930. This is regarded as the first time that all developed countries and underdeveloped countries step to the recession together. How about the Thai economies? The Thai economy in the first quarter this year contracted by minus 1.8% compared with 1.5% expansion in the previous quarter. We can see in this table. And on the expenditure side, private consumption slowed down with government consumption expenditure and total investment decline. Our production side, accommodation and food service activity sector, manufacturing, production sector, agriculture sector, transportation, and construction sector decline. The Thai economy in 2020 is expected to show a contraction in the length of minus 5% due to the sharp downturn of the global economies and they decline in the numbers of revenue from the tourists, the limitation of the COVID-19 outbreak in Thailand, and the tough conditions. The situation affects the world economies, implying the recession, resulting that the government in several countries must to use measures to stimulate their economies to relieve the impact of COVID-19. In consequence, this research proposed to study policy and measure situation in 6 different countries to review economics and social impact in response to COVID-19 outbreak, to analyze comparative policy and measure in 6 different countries, and to develop suitable policy recommendation for Thailand's context to review economic and social impact in response to COVID-19 for the long term and the short term. The population and the sample, this research is qualitative research study on policy and measure in different countries. The data was collected from research, article, news, and document during the beginning of the pandemic from January to September this year, and using environment for the analysis. The analysis applied the concept of the theory of crisis management, which it divides into policies and measures to respond the economic and social impact due to the spreading of COVID-19. Composite sampling is used in this research for the identification and selection of information list case related to the phenomena of interest. The target group includes 2 countries in Europe and America, which are USA, UK, and 4 countries in Asia, China, Japan, Singapore, and Thailand. For the research finding of USA, the government and central bank of the USA have declared the principle and the detail of some measures to decrease the economic and the impact from the spreading of COVID-19. The state expense is approximately about $2.4 trillion, and the credit guarantee limit about approximately $4 trillion. The total is over more than $6 trillion to support in this situation. Because it's still a lot of detail, I would like to summarize very quickly about the economic measure. $2 trillion for coronavirus response bill to provide widespread emergency relief for American and country economies to CARE Act about the trade facilities, loan facility, financial stimulus, loan guarantees, payroll tax, deferral and employees retention credits and business tax, something like that. About the labor and employment measures, the employee benefit, for example, requiring employing sponsor group health plan to cover certain COVID-19 testing and related healthcare visit, encouraging the use of telehealth service, expanding medical expense, providing relief to obtain leave, paid and unpaid leave, payroll protection measure. About the health and safety measure, stay-at-home business code, travel restriction, public gathering not over than 250 people, and free mask for people. About the export-import measure, export control issue are temporary finance rule to establish export restriction on certain type of personal protective equipment products used the response to COVID-19. The import, for example, Section 301 tariff exclusion from certain medical products from China, FDA policy develop new licensing and enforcement policy to expedite the importance of PPE. The research finding from UK about the economics measure introduced by the UK government includes the grant scheme, tax deferment, loan and finance facilities, stamp duty and tax, loan and employment measure, 6-pay support SMEs and employers with the additional cost of paying COVID-19 related SSP. The refund will be limited to this contribution. 500,000 employees out of the tax altogether, income support, coronavirus job retention scheme. About the export and import measure, the Department of Health and Social Care of the UK added 82 goods to the medicines and that cannot parallel export from the UK list. The PPE waive of import tax on medical equipment. Research finding from Singapore, the government added more than budgets to handle the spreading of COVID-19 under the title of Solidarity budgets allowed 3.1 billion Singapore dollar and addition from the to stimulus amounting 54.8 billion Singapore dollars, resulting 59.9 billion dollar in total to support about the business stimulus.
Excuse me, Dr. Panpot, only 2 minutes left.
Okay, thank you. And the household support and employment stimulus are, for example, job support scheme, the wage credit scheme, the measure to waive fee from store and restaurant, About the household support, employees who follow the quarantine order will be regarded as sick leave and receive paid hospitalization, something like that. About the Japan economics, fiscal and financial measures, tax and social securities, about the labor and employment measure, remote working, support, paid leave, something like that. It's quite to be the same from each country. China economic measure situation, tax exemption and refund, loan facility subsidized, and the export the cover medical device with medical registration certification before releasing the export. And Thailand, the economic measure, tax reduction, tax exemption, extension, and schedule adjustment, loan facilities, utilities, reduction in contribution, paid leave, and force majeure. And the export control exporting of mass is ban regarding of shipment side. This is all for the first round, and I would like to talk about the conclusion recommendation in the second round. Thank you.
Okay, Doctor. He kindly explored the various measures in the 6 countries for recovery, both in economic, social, and health due to the COVID-19 outbreak. So let's move to the next one from Dr. Leonie Pearson. She is Senior Researcher Fellow at Stockholm Environment Institute, ACI Asia. She will talk about pathway forwards, opening up the options for jobs and SDGs. Let's talk. I will give you some brief biography of the Dr. Leonie. Dr. Leonie Pearson is a Senior Researcher Fellow for ACI. Development in a variety of contexts, such as securing vulnerable people's access to water in SummerNet program, and initiating regional insights on ecological economic recovery from COVID-19. She has worked for more than 2 decades at the intersection of sustainability research, public policy. As a world-renowned ecological economist, she has delivered innovative knowledge to governments on ground policy change and over 150 articles and papers with keynote addresses. Her expertise is in sustainable development, landscape water management, livelihood policy, integrated assessment urban, rural, and the knowledge practice nexus. So I will give a stage to you, Dr. Leonie, please.
Thank you. Let me share my screen.
Sure.
Great. Well, thank you very much for welcoming Stockholm Environment Institute to this terrific annual meeting. We are excited to share some early research that we are also doing on looking at the impact of COVID and some recovery pathways to ensure that all of the ASEAN nations can deliver opportunities into the future that create jobs for communities, but they also deliver on the Sustainable Development Goals. Our research question is focused around the elements of what are the current COVID priorities for stimulus expenditure in ASEAN countries, and are they related to the Sustainable Development Goals? As we all know, sustainable development is at the centre of how ASEAN operates. The ASEAN Charter in 2008 explicitly stated sustainable development for the benefit of the present and future generations to place well-being, livelihood, and welfare of the peoples at the centre of the ASEAN community building process. Not only that, but over the last few years, sustainable development has become central to how ASEAN is focusing its elements into the future. In 2019, Thailand had the chairmanship of ASEAN, and in that time, it had the motto to advance partnerships for sustainability. Not only is the chairmanship an important role in ASEAN in focusing what the elements and the focus for that year of the ASEAN summits and work will be, but it also provides a really important stimulus for creating new structures and new identities for ASEAN to continue its work into the future. Such that, to quote from the chairman at the end of its time, that ASEAN has sought to promote sustainability in all dimensions throughout 2019. This has been carried forward through almost 300 ASEAN meetings hosted in Thailand throughout the year, wherein ASEAN's primary objective has been to develop and ultimately deliver concrete outcomes that benefit the people so as to contribute to building a people-centred ASEAN. At the same time in 2019, the Complementarities Report was released, which aligns the ASEAN way with the 17 Sustainable Development Goals as released through the United Nations. Here on the left-hand side, we also see the United Nations, through its SCAP program, released information about how ASEAN countries were delivering on the Sustainable Development Goals. As you can see, the middle line actually indicates how progress was going towards targets as identified in 2019. And once those targets in 2019 were hit, then we could see that the 2030 targets would be achieved. Obviously, there are not many Sustainable Development Goals that are meeting, or any of them that are meeting that 2019 target. And there are very few that are close. Critically, it's important to identify that there are some that were going backwards, such as SDG 12 around responsible consumption and production, SDG 13 on climate action, and reduced inequalities, SDG 10. So this creates us a space when we look at what is happening in ASEAN to be critical, and to be critical in a way that's constructive about how it is delivering on its sustainable development goals. Obviously, 2019 was an important time to set up for future progress and work in achieving all of these 17 targets and delivering on the ASEAN way. But of course, 2020 saw the strike of the coronavirus. My colleague, previous presentation has done an excellent job in outlining some of the challenges that were faced, the shutdowns, the multiple closures, enforced social distancing that happened, and the requirements for economic curfews. I have provided here a snapshot of some of the figures that have been presented, but in an ASEAN context. This is developed from my own work and others that are in this space at the moment. And I think it's really important here for us to understand that ASEAN at this time was meeting regularly and really trying to understand how it could recover, how it could work with the COVID crisis to ensure that its community was protected and growth would ensure. Let's take a highlight at some of the numbers on this table. They're too small to read, but the data is available. So firstly, we can see that in the ASEAN context, $350 billion US dollars has been committed for stimulus packages. This equates to, on average, 10.6% of GDP across the nations, as we've calculated based on the 2017 GDP figures and the 2020 stimulus figures. For ASEAN, about 2% of this expenditure is actually associated with loans. And some of those loans, most of those loans are obviously to the developing end of the ASEAN countries, because as we know, ASEAN has a split between some of the least developed and some of the most developed countries across the Asia-Pacific region. I think it's also interesting when we look at these figures that we can actually see what this stimulus expenditure per person actually works out to be. And it spreads in ASEAN from the lowest, which is 46 cents per person, which happens in the Lao PDR, all the way up to $11,204 per person in Singapore. So not only are we seeing across ASEAN that we have a spread of expenditure, total amount, but we also see that this is very different compared to the different countries that you're in. Obviously, the stimulus packages reflect that difference amount of expenditure that happens. I won't be running through the stimulus packages for those 10 nations. My previous colleague shows you how actually really comprehensive many of these programs are for different nations and how a really in-depth understanding needs to happen. Here, what we've done is using institutional analysis approach, as outlined in Restrepo and Clave in 2019. We've investigated the formal and informal structures and actions to identify how important or how thick the Sustainable Development Goals were to actually delivering on the post-COVID or the COVID recovery decision-making and stimulus packages. And here what we've found is that the results that I'm presenting here are about the decision-making processes. So ASEAN is based on the dialoguing process where key meetings are critically important for the priorities that are identified. We identified in the 14 key meetings that from their meeting minutes and their notes, that the types of SDGs that they actually worked with are outlined on this graph here, with the most important SDG mentioned the most, which is, as we would expect, SDG 8, which is about decent work and economic growth. So really focused on that jobs element. But of course, some of the other SDGs important were around health and partnerships. We see that it wasn't until June 26, which is about 4 months after the COVID crisis has started, that we're actually seeing a dedicated meeting focused on the delivery of Sustainable Development Goals and how that is playing out within the COVID crisis. Unfortunately, by the time June 26 came, 90% of the stimulus packages, so almost $330 billion had already been allocated. And all of that allocation is tied to particular activities and parts of economic stimulus that happens. I'd like to reflect in this meetings that we noticed that the numbers here just reflect if that meeting addressed the idea behind the Sustainable Development Goal. We should state that there was no meetings that actually identified Sustainable Development Goals as a key target for what they were trying to focus their meeting and their prioritization on. But of course, talking about jobs is exactly the same as talking about decent work and economic growth. And that's how we interpreted the literature and the information. We can also see that there are many Sustainable Development Goals here, and I have put an image for the Sustainable Development Goal 1, no poverty, as an example of many goals that were only mentioned once in those 14 meetings, and that was at a specific SDG meeting that was held on the 26th of June. So I think it's really clear that the Sustainable Development Goals in the meetings were not a high priority. They did not reflect some of those core elements that were missing when we looked at that 2019 sort of progress graph. So we can see those areas around climate action, reduced inequality or responsible consumption and production were not really mentioned throughout the meeting elements that were happening. Now let's move on to the actual information we found from the stimulus packages when we look at those. We can see clearly that the SDGs and the stimulus packages reflect those two good big priorities that we would expect: jobs and health. Almost all of the stimulus packages reflected these. And some of them also reflected the no poverty or SDG 1 priority that was coming out. So for example, the Philippines cash aid program for low-income houses really focused the economic stimulus on reducing poverty as well as supporting households through COVID-induced economic downturn scenarios. We see that in the economic stimulus packages, we've also got a lot of work, for example, things like grant trainings for workers impacted by industries and job support schemes, as happens in Malaysia and Singapore, or the enterprise finance scheme for SMEs that happens in Indonesia and Vietnam, and the loans restructure that Laos, Thailand and Philippines were actually undertaking for some of their businesses as well. And these are very clearly in that SDG 8 or decent work and economic growth. It's a shame, though, that we've looked through the stimulus packages and not one of them identifies a sustainable development goal or a target or an indice or a metric in which it should be measured as part of a success criteria. As such, we see most of this expenditure is going out in the goodwill in which it is designed and applied to support the people on the ground. But even when the IMF and the World Bank So part of those loans development organizations actually stipulated that you had to provide the loans and expenditure related to SDGs and measuring the progress against those targets. There has still been no evidence available that actually identifies that national expenditure and stimulus is tied to any of the SDG targets. I think it's also important to identify that whilst we didn't see many stimulus programs around zero hunger, there were many that also played across this element. So there was the support of households and access and food parcels, and that would be very clear zero hunger SDG 2 as well. I think we should also reflect, so we're saying that there are 3 SDGs targets that were identified, and there was only and 1 was implied with the zero hunger. So when we reflect on this work that we've been doing, we can see that the top ASEAN meetings, the stimulus packages are really focused on decent jobs and health, and also that the meetings are also focused on those priorities. But it's clear that when the meetings have other priorities, such as about partnerships, that aren't always reflected in the stimulus packages that are actually deployed across the different nations. And as such, it's a real shame that we don't have our meetings talking to our stimulus packages and what's delivered. We can also see that some of those priorities of SDGs, such as around responsible consumption or climate action and inequality, are not seen in much of the discussions in the meetings, and certainly not in the stimulus packages. But of course, we need to look forwards, not only backwards. And here we would like to say that our work is going to be progressing to look at where and how are the ASEAN nations actually coming out of the recovery from COVID. And SEI has undertaken scenario analysis across the world to look at 5 possible scenarios post-COVID. And we see that many of these scenarios play out against the priorities and sustainable development trajectories. And then some also have a tension with national priorities or local delivery and those sorts of elements. At the moment, we see that most of the ASEAN countries are sitting in a scenario that's focused around world of wars. And what this really means is that it's a fractured world in which there's an upsurge in nationalistic values, there is conflict grows substantially, and international institutions lose their legitimacy. Things like the United Nations, their push on the sustainable development priorities and goals associated with that. We say this because with everyone keeping their trade barriers up, with a real limited and lack of partnership work that's been happening in the past, it's very clear that nations will be delivering to and own their own priorities. And this may not reflect on the greater good, on perhaps some of their international signed priorities, such as the Sustainable Development Goals. And we really hope that any of the future scenarios that we'll be working for, that all of the ASEAN nations can really reflect back on their commitment to the Sustainable Development Goals and how they can achieve that. And in doing that, we've identified 2 key areas in which the future stimulus packages and delivery of stimulus packages, because they will be continuing on for the next 3 years in some countries and only in the 3 months in other countries. We've identified 2 ways that this can happen. The first is around co-benefits of investment. And co-benefits of investment is about understanding that if you are investing in particular elements, that there are ways that you can do it so that you can also deliver on sustainable development goals that are really effective and efficient. For example, there's been a lot of talk about infrastructure investment. And we've identified that a co-benefit could be about investing in clean and green infrastructure. And what this means is that we could be looking at delivering on Sustainable Development Goal number 9, which is, beg your pardon, focused on infrastructure, as well as Sustainable Goal 13, which is about inequality. We've also identified the idea that natural capital, which is a critical part of the service industry, which has been decimated by the COVID crisis, can actually be supported if we look at investing in natural capital assets in both their preservation, conservation, and obviously their rehabilitation in time. And this would deliver on, SDGs 9 and 15 at the same time. things like retrofitting of buildings or of other infrastructure assets can actually be done so that it delivers on clean energy sources as well as actually retrofitting current buildings. The other area we've identified that could deliver on both jobs and SDGs into the future for the ASEAN nations is about talking about a long-term double dividend. So with this, we're talking about things such as focusing on education and training, which is one of the Sustainable Development Goals, but targeting towards either women or minorities. And this would then, again, actually deliver 2 SDGs, and you would also have the benefits from the education and training. For example, identifying...
Excuse me, 1 minute. Sorry.
No, 1 minute. Perfect.
Yeah. Thank you.
For example, identifying job stimulus packages, but focusing those on either gender or minorities again. And then finally, looking at the research and development priorities, which have been identified in some of the other areas and nations, and really focusing on clean research and development. So how do we find our clean energy sources, our greener and cleaner technology uses, or vehicle and stimulation? So this is where we see the 2 areas, co-benefits of investment and long-term double dividends, are the ways that the ASEAN nations can deliver in the future, both on the Sustainable Development Goals and on jobs. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for the very interesting presentation. And your presentation reminds us that while we are thinking about COVID-19, we should take an SDG into account. So let's move to the next one. The next presentation from Dr. Walden Bello. He will talk about COVID-19 as crisis and opportunity. Dr. Walden Bello is currently the International Adjunct Professor of Sociology at the State University of New York at Binghamton and co-chair of the board of Focus on the Global South, a program of the Chulalongkorn University Social Research Institute. He is a former member of the House of Representatives of the Republic of the Philippines in 2009 to 2015 and a retired professor of the University of Philippines. He is the author and co-author of 25 books, the most recent which are Paper Dragons, China and the Next Crash, and Counter-Revolution, the global rise of the far right. Okay, so I will give a stage to you, Dr. Walden.
Okay, thank you very much. Let me just share the screen. Oh, it's there. Okay, let me, okay. So I would like to thank Dr. Nariman and Kusri, as well as Dr. Chantana, for inviting me to participate in this session today. I will not focus on the question of whether or not government social support measures are adequate to address the terrible economic impact of COVID-19 on people's lives. I think that in most countries in the region, these emergency programs are far from adequate, and my colleagues from Kusri have already shown that. What I'd like to do is focus on some economic vulnerabilities exposed by COVID-19 and how the impact of the virus might in fact provide an opportunity to effectively address them. In other words, I would like to focus on how COVID-19 might, despite its terrible effects, enable strategic economic transformations. So the first vulnerability is the disruption of global and regional supply chains. The second is distorted development owing to over-specialization in certain economic activities brought about by globalization. The third is the problem of growth and carbon emissions. COVID-19, it is our contention, tragic as it is, provides an opportunity to reduce these vulnerabilities. As someone said, let's not let a good crisis go to waste. First of all, on the disruption of global supply chains. Global supply chains have been considered one of the most important innovations of transnational corporations. They refer to the TNC's organization of production by locating different phases of production in different places throughout the globe, according to where they are best located in terms of overall profitability for the TNC. The key considerations are wage levels, tax rates, and transport costs. The creation of global supply chains has been a major cause of deindustrialization in and community disorganization in many countries and regions, such as the United States and Southeast Asia. Next page, please. The negative impact was well known before COVID-19. What COVID-19 did was to show the vulnerability of global supply chains to disruptions caused by pandemics, disasters, and wars. Thus, in January and February of this year, the halt in industrial production in China, owing to the lockdown around Wuhan and the drastic curtailment of industrial activity throughout the country, resulted in a rapid drawdown of supplies of essential commodities in many countries, importing a whole range of products from China, including face masks and other personal protective equipment, and essential medical devices such as ventilators and respirators, since these countries had lost capacity to produce them owing to deindustrialization. At the same time, countries that supplied China with industrial components and raw materials, such as the ASEAN countries, saw their economies suffer owing to the steep drop in Chinese industrial demand for their exports. We saw the same thing happen with food supply chains. More and more local and regional food systems that used to provide most of domestic production and consumption of food have retreated in the face of the onslaught by modern food supply chains. These supply chains, which are dominated by large processing firms and supermarkets that are capital intensive with relatively low labor intensity of operations, constitute roughly 30 to 50% of the food systems in China, Latin America, and Southeast Asia, and 20% of the food systems in Africa and South Asia. COVID-19 severely disrupted these supply chains. For instance, supplies of soybeans from Argentina to the rest of the world were disrupted when communities refused to allow vehicles carrying soybeans to the port of Rosario were stopped by communities which were fearful that they were carriers of the COVID-19 virus. In many parts of the world, local food producers were apparently ready to fill the need caused by supply chain disruptions, but they were handicapped by inappropriate, very restrictive health measures preventing food supplies from the surrounding countryside from entering the cities. COVID-19 provides an opportunity for countries to relocalize both industrial and agricultural production. This would not only reduce supply disruptions during emergencies, it would revitalize economies by reviving local industries and local agriculture and bring back decent jobs that have been lost to job displacing and wage reducing supply chains. Part of this process would mean ending TNC biased investment policies and ending unequal trade treaties, as well as reversing job-destroying commitments to the World Trade Organization. Next, please. Let me now move on to the problem of the structural distortion of an economy owing to over-specialization created by globalization, taking the Philippines and Thailand as examples. Over the last few decades, the Philippines has specialized in training and sending unskilled, semi-skilled, and skilled labor abroad. Over 10 million Filipinos now work abroad, a figure that comes to some 10% of the country's population. Labor export is now the country's biggest dollar earner, with remittances contributing something of the order of 20% of revenue from exports. With COVID-19 cutting down international travel by at least 90%, and with labor-receiving countries raising their barriers to the entry of workers and migrants, the Philippines has been hit badly. The rough estimate is that 700,000 overseas Filipino workers will lose their jobs by the end of the year, and thousands have been returning home to a country that has already seen a massive rise in domestic unemployment owing to the halt in economic activity caused by COVID-19. However, there has been one area that has not seen a drop in demand, but an increase: healthcare workers, of which the country has been one of the top producers for the world market. A tragic example of how globalization has distorted the Philippine economy is the contradiction between the massive needs for health workers in the country owing to COVID-19 and the rush of many health workers to leave the country to fulfill contracts abroad, where many were likely to be deployed to tend patients with COVID-19. This has resulted in unfortunate situations where representatives of the government have unfairly accused departing health workers of lack of concern for their fellow citizens, when in fact, it is structural conditions that the government has fostered with its labor export policy that is largely at fault. The equivalent of the Philippine specialization in labor export is Thailand. In Thailand is the tourist industry, which accounts for about 20% of the country's gross domestic product. The number of tourists visiting Thailand increased from 35.3 million in 2017 to 39.8 million in 2019. Tourists from China surpassed 10.9 million visitors in 2019, making up close to 30% of total tourists. Owing to COVID-19, tourist arrivals have dwindled to nearly zero, resulting in an estimated loss of 10 million jobs. The airline industry has been so foreign tourist dependent that practically all Thai-owned airlines, including Royal Thai Airways, TG, are close to collapse and can only remain open with government subsidies and soft loans. COVID-19 has revealed the perils of overdependence on a few industries: labor export in the case of the Philippines and tourism in the case of Thailand. The challenge to the Philippines is to transform its economy to create decent domestic employment opportunities that will reduce the need for people to go abroad. This will involve increasing domestic demand significantly, which can only be done if investment is focused on industries that cater to rising domestic demand rather than foreign demand, thus making local wages more attractive. Domestic demand, in turn, cannot be raised significantly without significantly reducing inequality. Also important will be curbing the country's continuing high population growth rate through implementation of the Reproductive Rights Act, of which, by the way, I was one of the authors in 2013. Some have said that the challenge to Thailand is to increase domestic tourism. I think this is important, but the real challenge is a bigger one, and that is how to radically reduce the Thai economy's dependence on tourism. This will mean further diversifying the country's industrial and service sectors to create more attractive, high value-added jobs to attract those now in the tourism sector. This will mean targeted investment as well as measures to reduce inequality and raise wages in what is now regarded as the world's most unequal society. The third challenge I'd like to address is one posed to all economies: how to take advantage of COVID-19 to push economies towards radical reductions in carbon emissions. During the recession that followed the financial crisis of 2008, carbon emissions dropped significantly. For instance, the 2008-2009 global financial crisis saw global carbon emissions declined by 1.4% in 2009. The pattern seems to be replicated during COVID-19, though in a much more massive way. Daily global carbon emissions decreased by 17% by early April 2020 compared with mean 2019 levels, just under half owing to changes in surface transport. At their peak, emissions in individual countries decreased by 26% on average. The task will be how to maintain and increase decrease carbon emissions after COVID-19 so that we don't return to the global financial crisis pattern of a rise of a decline in carbon emissions in 2009, followed by a 5.1% increase in emissions in 2010. The task will fall especially on countries that have either historically or presently been the biggest carbon emitters. One thing seems clear, that decoupling growth from increase in carbon emissions, that is, registering GDP growth while decreasing carbon emissions owing to more quote-unquote efficient, less carbon-intensive production processes does not work. Economies will have to degrow, not just reduce their rates of GDP growth. Since the imperatives of addressing poverty and respecting global justice and equity demand that many countries in the global south will have to experience some growth, then it is clear that the adjustment in terms of radically restraining growth and consumption must, for the most part, come from the rich countries. Though, of course, in both the rate of growth and consumption, the poorer countries must not follow the high growth model of the West and the Asian economies by putting the emphasis on equity enhancing strategies. The Green New Deal, put forward by progressive legislators in the United States, is a step forward, but it's still unclear if it completely embraces a degrowth paradigm. Let me just end by saying that the three challenges I have touched on will necessitate a great deal of political will and cooperation from civil society. I see them being effectively addressed only through democratic processes with a great degree of citizen participation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for the presentation. This is very interesting also. You give us some challenge in the COVID-19 outbreak, and however, actually, we would like to learn from your point about how to overcome this challenge, maybe in the second round. Okay. Okay, let's move to the last presentation from Professor Dr. Paulus Wilutomo. He is a professor of sociology at Department of Sociology, University of Indonesia. Actually, we know him from collaboration in Asian Academic Consortium on Social Wellbeing Study. Today, he will present about the social resilience in the new normal era, building social infrastructure. Please.
Okay, let me share my screen.
Sure.
Okay, thank you. My title is Indonesia Facing New Normal. This is a sociological perspective. The recent situation in Indonesia, I would like to just mention some information that to control the spread of COVID-19, Indonesia government has implemented several protocols. I think the same with most of other countries, wearing masks, washing hands with soap, physical distancing. And in a macro level, Indonesia did not practice lockdown policy due to the condition of Indonesia as an archipelago country. Instead, we have what we call it large-scale social restriction, such as work from home, study from home, worship from home, etc. The government has also launched some mitigating policies, such as social aids, about 30%, compensation, 20%, capital sharing or investment 20%, tax relaxation 15%, credit subsidy about 8%. But the general achievement, we can say that it is not satisfactory. Per September 13, 2020, the number of confirmed positive cases is 218,000 more. The additional cases is 3,600 per day. And the mortality rate is high, that is 4% from the confirmed positive case. Our sociological problems is the first is that during the pandemic emergency, when pandemic come, the government take control. We have a government-led action. Everything is led by the government. And this is then show that what happened as a social reactions. There is a massive civil disobedience about what the government has instructed the people to do. There is massive social disobedience. Also, some corruptions happened. And then we have a social distrust, social unrest, and anger. This is a sociological problem. So how do we analyze this situation? We know that every social problem has always have objective and subjective points of view. Objectively, statistics are showing an alarming increase of infected victims. And the government and also the elite educated population usually rely on this information. They trust this information very easily. But subjectively, many people, especially people from the lower level of economy, they feel safe. There is nothing happened to them. They feel uninfected because there is no symptom. So they define the situations as not very serious. And the government, in this case, could not force all the population to conform to their definitions of the situation and force the people to obey their protocol. Because social order is a negotiated order. So, relying on people's fear to punishment, I think this is not enough. So the government cannot just emphasizing on the punishment to the people. But in this case, in the case of this pandemic, in the case of this COVID-19, people must understand completely the logic and the behavior of the virus, which we all know this is very tricky. They have to know, they have to understand completely this logic. And then they can internalize all the protocols of health of the government. The government socialization program also must be differentiated based on the complexity of the society. That is based on social stratification. Different strata has different way of socialization. But at the first time of this pandemic, the government just do the same thing to all the people, regardless of the complexity of stratification and social differentiation. And more importantly, the government must know that they have to do everything community-based. Because if they do it in the macro level with the instruction that they give to all the people with the same method, I think that would not be very effective. So to create full understanding and awareness of the people, the communication, information, and education needs to be reviewed and redesigned by the government. And right now, the government has already realized that, and they will start to make a review and redesign of all this communication, information, and education methods, so to make the people more aware of the danger of this virus. This is the first problem, and the second is preparing social transformation toward the new era. We know that COVID-19 pandemic, as also Professor Bello just has said, COVID-19 pandemic is opening a window of opportunity for us to do social transformation. The recovery program of this pandemic may not just go back to the old pattern or the business as usual, but we have to build the better quality of societal life. So this is better quality of societal life is very important for us in the future, which I think include at least 3 basic elements. Namely, we have to improve our social structure, especially here as the pattern of power relations. Secondly, we have to try to also take care of our culture. We have value system, norm, and tradition. Which one is bad and which one is good and have a potential to develop us? So we have to take care of our culture. And the third thing is social process. This is the dynamic of social interaction and activism. This is very important because all the activity of the people is on this social process. And 3 of these have to be developed to make a better quality of societal life in the future. The government concept that is called Build Back Better. Okay, I agree on this concept. We have to build back, but better. We don't go back to the old pattern. So it means that we have to have a societal ecological development, which is systemic and holistic. It's not just to improve one sector, but to leave the other sector and so on. So we have to create social resilience of the nation with the smart citizen. And in government of Indonesia, learning from unsuccessful lesson lately, now has realized the strategic function of community-based approach. Before this time, the government, maybe because of there are panicking about the sudden attack of this COVID-19, they try to control everything from the side of the government. But now government has realized that community have a strategic function. So there is a shifting from structural approach, which is led mainly by government, to the more processual approach, which is mobilizing popular participations with their social capital. Sociologically, the social transformation in Indonesia must be based on the virtue of its traditional value system called gotong royong. But this is essentially social capital, because we have already that capital. Yeah. But the problem is how this capital is rebuilt more intensively and have some attention by the government. The sociological question is, how does the government empower the community to function as social infrastructure? If physically we need a physical infrastructure, now for building the social transformation, we need social infrastructure. So we can maximize the power of social capital to build social resilience until up to the national level. Start from the community to the national level. And if we think about social capital, the development of a nation, we know, needs strong social capital. But we may not take for granted the usefulness of social capital. We cannot just take for granted. We know smallest level of community normally has range of bonding social capital. But we cannot rely only on bonding social capital, because it tends also to be very exclusive, very strong, but very exclusive. And in some extreme situation, it can be full of conflictual fanaticism. So we need to build the functions of larger communities to bridge and synchronize or harmonize the interest of smaller communities. That is what we call bridging social capital. And eventually, we need to build linking social capital, which is something that can link the interests of all levels of communities to some larger institutions in the macro and national level, up to the central government. We have to be linked by what we call it, the linking social capital. So this is, if we want to develop our social capital, we have to develop those dimensions. My recommendations is the government must shift its structural approach based mainly on bureaucratic power to the social dynamic and activism in community level. That's what we call community-based development. Community must be function as social infrastructure. What is that? This is that community-based inclusive civil society organization, which formally have to be supported by the government to function as a self-reliant agent of development based on local social cohesion. We have to know that social infrastructure is more inclusive than, for instance, common organization, which usually tend to serve its member interests exclusively. But social infrastructure is more inclusive. The government must support social infrastructure with political capital. Namely, all those social infrastructures must be given by the government legal authority and also some facilities, material and financial, to play its roles as inclusive agent of development at the community level. And now we can see the functions of social infrastructure. First, it could be a public sphere for problem solving at local level, because all the problems cannot be solved by the government, by the central government, but the people have to solve their own problem in the local level with the public sphere in the local level. And social infrastructure can help local bureaucracy to collect data, information from the grassroots, and distributing government social aid. This is a lot of a weakness in Indonesia from the local bureaucracy. So social infrastructure in the local level can help this. And it can also become agent of people, education, social control. And social infrastructure could also become center of local economic collaboration. So, and during this pandemic, local people now are trying to help themselves by economic collaborations at the community level. It can also become local security system, local information exchange, offline or online, and fortifying social cohesion and solidarity through, at the same time, bonding, bridging, and linking social capital. And what is the relationship with the future impact on social transformation? By implementing the building of social infrastructure at the community level, we actually built a more real democratization. Even, I think, more real than just having some political parties. Because if our communities are strong and self-reliant, we will become a very strong society. If all people in the community level could organize themselves as self-reliant civil society with the support of the government, we can create a new civilization. This is, I think, a sociological dream. And this is what Albert Einstein said. Imagination is more important than knowledge. Thank you very much.
Your presentation, I think, motivate our work back to the focus more on social and community scheme and value social capital, supporting by like social, political capital and also infrastructure. Okay, thank you very much. And then let's I will invite Professor Dr. Chantana Banpasirishot to deliver some view and also experience about your work with the COVID-19. Please.
Hello. Thank you so much for inviting me. And thank for all the presentations, very insightful. I'm so excited to hear, and many key issues have been raised. Honestly, I think I would need time to digest all this detailed presentation, but I don't have that time. So I'm trying to, I think raising the question is more important than giving the answer. Looking at the question asked by the organizer, whether we are having a sustainable recovery or same. Same is a Thai word, right? I would say we are same at the moment after hearing this. I think we are discussing quite normative, something what should be, what is supposed to be, what should be the way out. But in reality, maybe same. Anyway, let me start from, maybe I have to work backward. I think Professor Walden Bello have given us another level of understanding the crisis. So I think if we want to solve the crisis, I think we have to define it, what kind of crisis we are facing. After hearing Walden, COVID is small things. The bigger thing is, in fact, our economic system is so much dependence on external determinants, and it's very much fragile, in fact, that we never realized until the COVID came. So how do we define the crisis is very important. I think we are facing double crisis, and I fully agree with you with all the situation of having maldevelopment for some decades already, and it's only revealing. We didn't feel it until the COVID comes. So the second question we ask, recovering from what? If we are looking at the crisis into two layers, the top layer is the COVID crisis, and the lower layer that we don't usually see is the crisis of capitalist development, a certain kind of capitalism. Then I hear a paper that investigate all the package in different countries, money is spent, and also we hear the progress of SDG. If SDG is an opportunity, are we moving towards that direction? Now, the information and the data provided by the presenters doesn't give me confidence that we are changing. I think most countries, more or less, one way or the other, using very similar measures, spending the money to create jobs, but maybe not more than that. I think Dr. Pearson also presented an information that we're not moving to the window of opportunity provided by SDGs, not yet. And not to mention that in 2019, not to mention in the future, that I'm not sure that we are moving towards that direction. Now, what are the hope? I think at the moment we are very normative in the sense that think what other things should be done. But I think it's important to know what other things to be done. Question is that What driving change? What do we have so far as the capital to move on? I think the idea of social transformation, structural transformation out of the crisis is very imperative. You have to go through it. But how can we do that? Look at the impact of the COVID is not only on economic and on health, but it's also on social and on the society. There are not everyone agree on the measures, and the COVID and the measures probably expand the gap of inequality. So there are a problem of social fragmentation also out of the COVID, not to mention the political impact on this. So I think the last presentation referred to the importance of local community. I think now it comes to the fact that the future of the society in Southeast Asia very much rely on the community. The study of Local Development Institute recently that released, they investigate in Thailand, in Thailand only, a survey on community around Thailand for different regions, and selectively, and they came out that in fact the COVID should be better managed by local. You know, the impact of the COVID should be better managed, and they even suggest that there should be a COVID mitigation fund for the local. So I think one of the imperatives is that if we want to change the society will be transformed. Local community must be taken into consideration seriously. We're talking about decentralization. You're talking about devolution of power for ages, and it is not coming. So looking at how the recovery is managed by different government is very much centralized. That's why I think that if we keep on the same model of governance, we're not going to go through the crisis to a new transformation. So my questions, actually, Dr. Pearson has provided scenarios, but I'm not sure which scenario is the most promising and which scenario is more realistic than the others, and also make some suggestions of in investment. I think the SDG can be a landscape, a new landscape of moving, but there is politics into the SDG, and when we talk about fixing poverty, it's not only require the money that go directly to poverty eradication, but it has to do with other goals, right? Land, right to land, and it's also go to consumption, sustainable consumption. So things are interrelated, and I think if to take SDG at the same time social transformation as a two goals towards a new kind of new normal. It's not only health new normal, but society would need a platform to really come to a new, I don't know, social contract but it needs, like Warden said, that democratic governance. Now, this is a fundamental question to this region, whether we have that. And it's become chicken and eggs, which one come first, democracy or recovery from the COVID. So I don't have any particular idea to suggest, but I think we are really walking a very thin line to fall into the same rather than the transformation, considering the political situation, political driving force, political will and leadership. So checking back on the civil society, checking back on the political sphere, public sphere, I'm not sure whether you agree with me, it's somewhat shrinking. But if it is shrinking, how can the new idea emerge? In transforming out of the crisis. Narratives of crisis is very important. Who defined the crisis? At the moment, I think mostly the central government, with the idea of disease control and and security, that it overrule many other possibilities. Now, how far this will continue? Is it only temporarily? Very difficult to say. Look at the investment, all the packages related to giving the subsidies, measures on economic, but not so much on social. And if you refer to social infrastructure, nobody think of that. And therefore, to create an investment for the society to be able to stand on own feet and to be able to take control of their future destiny, it's really bleak. I mean, I don't see much of the hope. So it sounds very pessimistic from my side after hearing some of the data that things are not moving into the direction that will create the resilience in the society part. So that's it. That's what I can share. I'd like to hear what you think. Thank you.
What did
The question also go through also in some of the, I have raised some question to some of the speakers, but I haven't mentioned name. For example, Walden, do you think that you have been saying that we are moving to a degrowth economy long time back and it's never happened? Do you think it will really happen? And for Professor Pearson, Dr. Pearson, what scenario you think it will happen? Adaptive mosaic seems like it should be the one, but whether what is driving to that? And other question related to the mitigation. There are also a problem of inequality. Dr. Pon put inequality, the widening gap, maybe out of the measures. How can that be overcome? And also issue on social transformation based on social capital. At the moment, the COVID did something on the capital. It somehow decreased the bridging capital, and people are. I don't know if we can look at some countries that has ethnic problems, and those who are minorities will suffer more and become more vulnerable. Okay, thank you. That's question.
So, Dr. Leonie, do you have any feedback on Professor Chantana's question?
I think Professor Chantana has really outlined many of the challenges that are facing a recovery. Is it a transformation or is it a transition? What are the elements that you want to be aiming towards? I agree, SDGs have political overlay, but that's why we looked at the elements that people were looking at. Are they looking at poverty, food security? Were they looking at sustainable consumption? And I think it's important that we hold true to those rather than just identifying a single target or a single metric. But the challenge for what is the future, I mean, I'm excited like you to see what that would be. In SEI, we've identified these 5 futures, these 5 possible scenarios. I would love the chance to test this out across some of our communities in the ASEAN region to identify where their political leaders really think they're going. What are they driving towards? Because I think you're exactly right in highlighting the elements of needing our social capital to be built. This is about a social contract that we need to be signing. So who is taking us there and what is their vision? And I think this is where we need to tap into local knowledge to ensure that we're grounded in the right space.
Yeah, this could be a topic of our research question. A transition.
Okay, we should talk more. This would be good, yeah.
A transition, yes.
Okay, next, Dr. Walden, please.
Okay, yes, thank you very much to Dr. Chantana for the very provocative comments. I would just like to maybe support a number of the things that she had mentioned. One is when I mentioned degrowth, I was specifically looking at the challenge that would have to be met, especially by the more advanced capitalist countries. And definitely in terms of Western Europe, the United States, Canada, Australia, I think that this idea that somehow by more efficient production ecologically, you can delink growth from carbon emissions, I think that's now been proven false, which means that the advanced countries, which have historically been the most biggest contributors to climate change and carbon emissions, really have the responsibility to adopt degrowth policies at this point. So that was specifically addressed to them because developing countries cannot yet, in fact, undertake such policies. The second point that I really quite support is looking at how the current global structures of capitalism and the way they have distorted development, that this is an opportunity to COVID provides the opportunity maybe to really look at them and see whether we can turn things around. Like I mentioned the issue of global supply chains that have had such a negative impact on so many countries. And also the distorted development such as the labor export policy of the Philippines and the tourist industry in Thailand. That this, it really forces the governments to take on a real strategic transformation when it comes to this. Otherwise, when the next crisis arises, you will have the same kind of massive laying off of people, like 10 million in Thailand, and in the Philippines, just people coming home because they no longer have their jobs abroad. So I think strategic transformations are in order. And the third thing, which I fully support, is what Ajahn Chantana said, and also Professor Dr. Wirotomo has emphasized the importance of democratic participatory governance, change from below rather than from just central governments dictating the policies. I think that the Philippines and Indonesia have sort of really followed this imposition of central government dictating policy. And the Philippines may be extremely so because Duterte's posture has been basically, you better follow the rules or we'll shoot you. I mean, he in fact has said that his orders is that if people disobey, shoot them. I mean, he's a crazy guy. That's I think the common thread in both Indonesia and the Philippines in response to COVID. I think what is happening in Thailand is interesting in the sense that, well, Thailand is one of the few countries where COVID has been brought under control, but it's not been because of the central government. In fact, the central government leadership made a lot of screw ups, especially in the beginning. With like the initial attempts until it was really in my reading is that it was the public health authorities and the volunteers and civil society that really stepped in, building up on previous civil society public health successful campaigns like the family planning program, the Clean Bangkok, and anti-littering campaign, the Michai's the effort to push condoms, for instance, the anti-smoking campaign. So you had a lot of civil society, public health authority successful campaign, and I think COVID came right into this. So I think Ajahn Chantana that when it comes to Thailand, I would say that the political authorities were superfluous. In fact, the best contribution they made was to get out of the way, okay, and not interfere with the doctors and the civil society cooperation. So democratic governance, I really feel is going to be very important. And I would just like to add two things more that might, in fact, have a more positive note here. When we look at, for instance, in Thailand at this point, the upsurge of the students, okay, across from high school to university students asking for more democracy in essence. I think that's been quite positive, and to some extent, you have the same thing right now in the Philippines, but to a lesser scale, because in the case of the Philippines, as with many other countries where you have authoritarian leaders, the fact that they've not been able to deal with the COVID-19 crisis has reduced their legitimacy. So, for instance, Duterte used to be very popular, but because of his incompetence in dealing with COVID-19, a lot of people who used to think he was great have been changing their minds. So COVID-19 has not been good for many authoritarian leaders. And I would say probably that's been the case in Thailand and the Philippines. I'm not sure about Brazil, but maybe, or about India, but maybe we have the same kind of thing developing there. So that's it. I also would like to thank all the participants. I've learned a lot about this, and I hope that we can continue this dialogue. Thank you very much again for inviting me to participate in it.
Are you leaving now, or you still with us until what time?
No, I'm still here. But
yes.
I was just saying that maybe the other presenters probably should could give us their opinions.
Okay. Next, Dr. Ponpot, could you please share your idea about to how overcome the social inequality?
Yeah, thank you, Ajahn Chantana, for your recommendation and your question about how to overcome the social inequalities. For me, I have some recommendation from this situation. We have to change mindset for the long-term national economic structure must be adjusted by focusing on economy with more self-reliant and with opportunity for citizens to reduce inequalities. For example, circular economies, development in communities, tourist attraction, and occupational development for communities, green city development, something like that, labor skill development, and the concept of new way of economic growth must be changed. We cannot measure the economic growth by the number anymore, I think, because we have to focusing on the balanced growth. For example, the SDGs based on development and focusing on driving BCG economies, bio-circular, something like that are mainly concentrated on balance and sustainable growth, along with the strength of the local economies. And the next one, economic system must be reformed to facilitate sustainable development growth by creating an open and fair competitiveness market system for competition that motivate self-development for labor and motivating an entrepreneur to invest and develop innovation for increasing their competitive ability in the world market. Including public policy reform with the top goal to solve inequalities, increasing taxation efficiencies and social welfare reform that cover informal level. And the last thing that I would like to say that the awareness and the participation of people sector must be created for speeding up upskill development, more flexibilities of self-adaptation to economic activities. Under the new normals, the people sector must speed up their self-efficiencies development to become future level in the 21st century, in which humans must inevitably work with machine and technology. Therefore, lifelong learning is required, particularly in specialized fields for the future careers. Technological knowledge, online marketing, something like that, foreign languages, and entrepreneurial skill for higher employment opportunities and income. Thank you very much.
Okay, let's move to the next, the last one. Professor Paulus, could you please?
Okay, thank you to Professor Chantana. Okay, to say the truth, I'm myself is not 100% confident that the government will move to the more to the more to the community after this COVID-19. But right now, I know that the government start to realize that the community level have the strategic value in solving this national problem, because the government himself is now already come to the thoughts that they cannot control all the people, more than 200 million people. But and then we, especially the sociologists and social sciences, has already appealed to the government that look at our community potentials that has already been, in fact, Indonesia has already have some institutionalized community organization that has been institutionalized by the government in nationwide. So we just try to empower, because right now those community has already been formally institutionalized, but in fact the government never gave a real political capital to all those community. So the community is not functioning in a very effective way. That's why now we push the government. If you want to control the situation, you have to rely also on the participation of the government and the community level. So I'm sure that if the government, especially during when they are entering the new normal, if they can empower the community to participate, and they can empower the more social capital of the community to grow, is that bonding, bridging, and also linking social capital at the same time, I think we will be much more resilient in the next future. But I also mentioned in some discussion that if we want to democratize our society, it's not enough if we only give the opportunity to the political parties to take the role, because what really happened, as we also know in every other country, that political party is usually will become an elite of the government, and they will do the same again. So if the government now give the democratization to the civil society, especially in the community level, and they become strong, they will not playing politics. But in terms of democratization, it will produce a real democratization. That's why I think this is very strategic. And we, the social scientists in Indonesia, is now trying to push further the government to see that opportunity. We try to grab that opportunity during this this COVID-19 situation, so the government can give more political capital to all the community organization and civil society in Indonesia. So I think if it has been successful, I think the democratic impact of the society in the Indonesian society will be big enough, the impact. Okay, so this is, I have to be very frank that as I have said that this is not 100% confident about that, yeah? But I think there is some opportunity to achieve this one. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for all speakers. And now, actually it's now 3:30, but we extend for 5 minutes, and so we have only 5 minutes left. Does anyone have some more recommendation or observation, or you want to deliver us some idea about to passing through COVID-19 for sustainable recovery? Does anyone? Yes, please, Satan.
Okay, I think the COVID came instantly and then we're falling apart. But to get out of this, I think we need time. And I like the idea of we have to see things in transition. And I think in transition, we have to address key issues of the existing global economic structure. That is the global supply chain. I think, I don't know, maybe Walden has already answered the answer for that. How can we, that trapped in the traditional global supply chains in many type of industries, how can we get out of that? Now, and people say that, hey, we have a new model of economy, BCG, bio, circular, green economy. Are we falling into the same trap of the global supply chain? Because it's require high technology. I don't know how things can be escaped, especially the gap between the industrialized, the former advanced country and developing country. Anyway, the transition, we should answer this question. And I think the opportunity is not seized yet. But the crisis and opportunity are almost the same word in Chinese, but I think we have wasted many times in the past that we haven't really seized this opportunity to move to transformation. We need to, I don't know, maybe at the regional level, a document that describe the crisis, and then have a different pathway, as Pearson said, that we need to be clear about what are the options. Who is doing this? I think it's a responsibility. I don't think that the government, the state that normally stabilize things, would do things such a thing like this. So another network and platform has to be formed to work on this transition out of the COVID. The COVID itself, I think the mitigation, the packages, I'm not so concerned as much as the real crisis that is on the bottom layer, as Warden had mentioned. And if SDG is an opportunity, it's already in the landscape of global landscape that we are moving towards that. But it's not really energized. No? We have to do something about it. And I think part of the transition, apart from the global supply chain and the realization of SDG, I think the structure of governance, the local the importance of local community in take control of themselves and in creating resilience is very, very imperative, and it should be part of the transition. And like Walden, I have to thank all the presenters. I learned a lot from your research.
Thank you very much. Dr. Leonie, do you want to give some information? Thank you.
Professor Chantana said mainly what I was going to say, so I'd like to thank her for doing a very nice summary. But I think at any crisis, there is an acute phase where you need to treat the injury that is there. So for COVID, that is treating the health implications. And then afterwards, you have a long recovery. And I think we need to be talking more about our recovery now, not these stimulus packages for this acute phase. And our recovery has a more normative element and a more deterministic element about it. And until we start, I believe, putting pressure on solutions, our pathways to recovery that embody our elements of social resilience or sustainable development, we are not going to be seeing them in the approaches that our governments are going to have. So I've learned a lot from this panel. So I would really echo a big thank you for having this panel. But I would also ask that all of us could try and promote these ideas so that we can inform governments that are looking for ideas and solutions on how to move forward. I think this is an important part of what we can do is to share our knowledge. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Dr. Walden, do you want to give some recommendation?
Well, you know, I would just like again to thank everybody. But I just would like to emphasize what both Professor Viratomo and Ajahn Chantana said, the importance of the political and governance. I think that so many of the structural economic decisions that need to be done rely on, in fact, a very sensitive system of governance. And I think that that is still something of a big deficit in the region, and which is, and I think this, for instance, the students in Thailand, for instance, are, my sense, are on the right track. They, you know, I think they see that without something happening at the governance level, it's going to be very hard to have changes at the infrastructure and at the social structural level. So again, to emphasize what both Ajahn Chantana and Ajahn Viratomo have emphasized, really the central importance of a change and transformation in governance. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Dr. Ponpot or Dr. Paulus, do you have any idea or comment, final comment?
Yeah. Thank you very much. I totally agree with Dr. Paulus, Dr. Leonie, and Dr. Walden that COVID-19 is a crisis opening up the option, the opportunities for the social transformation. For me, the more recommendation, the policy and measurements we provide to reduce short-term impact for target group with implementation plan. The long-term national economic structures must be adjusted by focusing on economy with more self-reliant and with opportunity for citizens to reduce inequalities. The concept of new way of economic growth must be changed by focusing on the balanced growth and educational quality must be enhanced with human efficiency development and technological development to enhance growth to catch up with the world under rapid change. The economic system must be reformed to facilitate sustainable growth by creating an open and fair competitive net market, and awareness and participation of the people sector must be created for speeding up skill development and more flexibility of self-adaptation to economic activities. And finally, the database system of the government sector should be developed along with more flexible social system to change. That's all for me. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Paulus.
Okay, I thanks so much for being invited in this panel, and I learned a lot from every panelist who bring various topics. What I have to emphasize as a conclusion is that we have to see the social capital into all those dimensions, not only the bonding social capital, but bridging and linking at the same time. The linking is usually very weak, and this is the responsibility also of the government and larger communities, larger institutions to build this linking social capital. If the nation can bring all together at the same time, I think it will become have a very good impact. That is what I said, as we have to build the social infrastructure for that. Yeah, and social infrastructure can function very well if the government give political capital, give authority to the people at the lower level. Authority is very important, because if they don't have authority, then they will will be difficult to develop their own community. So still they need a social capital, the authority from the government. Thank you very much for this meeting.
Thank you very much. Thank you for our presenter and also Professor Dr. Chantana. Actually, this is our first time for International Forum for International View on COVID-19. I think this is a good opportunity that we can create, and it is possible to create this kind of forum in the future. Before we end of this forum, could you please, all the speaker, could you please open your camera to take a photo together? Professor Paulus, could you please? Okay. Thank you.
Okay.
Okay.
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
1, 2, 3. Cheers.
Thank you very
Thank you
much.
very much.
Okay. Thank you very
Bye-bye.
much.
Bye-bye.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much to you all. Okay. ค่ะและสำหรับนะคะทาง Facebook Live นะคะวันพรุ่งนี้ค่ะเราจะมีครั้งที่4นะคะในการจัดสัมมนาวิชาการของเรานะคะในวันพรุ่งนี้ก็จะเริ่มในตอนบ่ายโมงถึงบ่าย3โมงนะคะเป็นเรื่องนัยยะสำคัญของสังคมหลังโควิด -19 สู่อนาคตค่ะเราจะมองตั้งแต่ภาพอดีตไปจนถึงภาพปัจจุบันและมองไปถึงภาพอนาคตนะคะขอบพระคุณทุกคนนะคะสำหรับการรับชมในวันนี้ค่ะขอบคุณค่ะสวัสดีค่ะ